evening, Johannes Molefe, accused of sexually abusing multiple pupils at Soweto's Xuma primary school, is a free man.
He's free tonight because the state failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he was guilty. That's according to acting Judge Peet Johnson. The former school patrol guard was arrested and remanded in custody. He's been there since October last year after over 50 pupils at the school complained of sexual abuse.
There were too many material inconsistencies. That's what the court found today. In his 3-hour-long judgment, acting Judge Peet Johnson said he had made provision for some errors in the recollection of the minor witnesses. He described the testimony of the school, the teddy bear clinic which conducted the counseling of the pupils, and the state prosecutors as a comedy of errors. The judge read out a list of code of conduct expected from prosecutors. Among this, he included an expectation to uphold integrity and objectivity, impartiality and independence, of which he says in this case they weren't adhered to. He described this moment as an embarrassing one. The parents of the alleged victims were understandably distraught following the verdict.
The parents are very devastated by the decision that was taken by the court today. And remember, they've been devastated from the beginning of this case, because even during the case, there were a lot of discrepancies that were done, especially by the police officer. I must indicate that the police officers were very negligent in terms of handling this case. As a result, we even raised this with the South African Police Service to say there are so many discrepancies from the word go. So as it is now, to a certain extent, we are not surprised by the verdict, because it was because of the negligence of the police.
The Education Department acknowledged an error on the part of its teachers.
We can't chastise, prosecution. These are our stakeholders, we work with them. But what we are saying from ourselves, as educators, as Department of Education, we should have managed it better, from the word go, because that's where everything started. Probably incidences that occurred at our school led to probably prosecution doing, or conducting themselves in the way they've conducted it, because the judge was very clear and it was very scathing to say it is unacceptable the way they've managed the case. But for us, we are saying the moment the case was then reported to educators, that's when we should have done better.
The organization Women and Men Against Child Abuse, who've been following the case from the start, say they're disappointed in the manner in which the state built its case.
The accused was let go on a technicality. It is something that speaks to training. Our officials who are supposed to be protecting our children should be trained in a certain way. And that evidence was contaminated by somebody whose speciality is to conduct and collect evidence is deeply disappointing. However, we do believe that acquittal is not the absence of guilt.
While the parents insist on appealing the ruling, the organization has cautioned against this, saying the same evidence thrown out today would be used. Hitekani Magwedze SABC News, Johannesburg.
Well, for more on this story, we are now joined by Hitekani Magwedze for SABC News. Of course, this story absolutely shocking, hearing the result that has been coming out. One can only imagine the reaction from the parents.
Yeah, Shante, you can just imagine that ever since the alleged assault happened last year, the children must have been going through so much trauma, having to relive this and having to talk to the parents about this. And, some of the parents were saying that the children wake up at nights crying and such. So you can imagine, building up to the judgment, there's been so much emotional trauma that they've had to deal with. Now this judgment that is quite unfortunate from where they stand, saying that the law has really let them down. Some of them were saying that they've chosen not to take the law into their own hands, but trust that the state will protect their children, and that hasn't happened. But the impact is also largely on child protection. The judge spoke about the teachers of the school having let the children down because they brought them into one place and didn't really conduct the assessments properly. The teddy bear clinic also didn't conduct themselves properly, and the prosecutors. So all these arms impact their failure to handle themselves properly with children, in this case, impacts on child protection.
Essentially, the NPA has dropped the ball here. You know, we've just come out of 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, specifically on young women and children. A couple of days ago, we also commemorated World Human Rights Day. Take us through that.
Look, I think at the back of all those events that you've just spoken about, it laid on the judge's heart even heavier, because in his words, there was a comedy of errors. He was embarrassed about the conduct of the prosecutors, having to go through the code of conduct of the prosecutors in court, saying that these are the code of conduct that you as prosecutors are supposed to adhere to. And in this case, they dropped the ball, as you rightly said. They didn't adhere to anything in terms of independence, objectivity, integrity, impartiality, and such. He says they dropped the ball completely, and that's primarily the reason why he had to give the judgment that he did.
Now, just going back to the parents, you mentioned earlier on that the parents were hoping that the justice system would prevail and they wouldn't want to be taking law into their own hands. Have you been able to get reaction from them in whether they would want to pursue this case further?
Look, they want to. They would like to appeal the judgment, but you know, the problem there is that the evidence that would have to be used would have to be the same evidence that was used, and the judge found that there were severe inconsistencies in terms of the statements, the police statements that the children initially gave, and the witness evidence at the witness stand in court that they gave there. So saying that it seems that the children had been coached to relay some kind of evidence that was not truth. So it's a difficult situation, obviously, for the parents, but they want to appeal this.
Thank you very much for joining us in studio. That was Hitekani Magwedze on Johannes Molefe, accused of sexually abusing multiple pupils at Soweto's Xuma primary school. Today he walks scot-free as the state failed to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt.